Welcome to this installment of supplemental lectures provided by PNC's Concurrent Enrollment Program. My name is Alexandra Kindle, and I will share some information with you that comes out of my History 151 course at Purdue University North Central. Today we'll take a short look at the people who dominated Southern life socially, politically, and economically. This means we must take a look at King Cotton as well. Growing cotton across the southern United States was not inevitable. For the early nation, tobacco, rice, and indigo were the most profitable crops prior to 1793. Only a few planters raised cotton. There were two types of cotton available at the time: long staple or black seed cotton, and short staple cotton, also called green seed cotton. Long staple cotton could be grown on the sea islands of South Carolina and Georgia and along the coastline of those states. Its black seeds could be easily removed by slaves, allowing for some profit on the crop. Beyond the coastline, farmers could grow short staple cotton, but it was too difficult to remove the green seeds. A few planters used it for home consumption, but the difficulties of processing the crop kept planters in more traditional crops. Yet with the invention of the cotton gin, planters no longer had these problems. Eli Whitney invented a small engine, also called a gin, that could remove seeds from short staple cotton with little effort, making it possible to grow cotton in the mainland U.S. for a profit. Within 8 years, cotton production went from about 3 million pounds grown in South Carolina and Georgia to 80 million pounds in the southern states. Without textile mills in the U.S., most of this cotton went to the textile mills in England during the Industrial Revolution there. But as the nation eased into the 19th century, this would change. During the period after the War of 1812 to about the 1840s, the nation went through a major transition economically and socially. The market revolution transformed American society from a pre-industrial to an industrial nation. Americans saw the early stages of industrialization, starting with the factories putting out textiles in New England, as well as changes in agriculture and transportation. Please see the lectures on the market revolution for details. Most important, Americans changed how they worked and lived based on producing for the market, instead of focusing on subsistence and survival. While the market revolution explains an economic change, it also affected how people worked and how they thought about their work. Here you can see how aspects of life changed as Americans transitioned from pre-industrial lifeways to industrial ones. And while you look at the terms on the right, think about how those terms define your life. Can you go to the supermarket and not see anybody you know, thus being basically socially anonymous? If you live in a small town, you probably understand more of the values on the left, but life here in the 20th century is more mechanized, and we are more dependent on time, and that more so than season. So think about some of these issues. There were also political changes during these years, and two parties emerged to represent different ideas about how the nation should grow. While the Democrats focused on territorial expansion, the Whigs emphasized more complex growth. Both parties had southern and northern wings, but the Whig, Henry Clay, brought much attention to the politics of helping economic growth through federal intervention in the economy, especially to help business. The American system was a policy that supported the economic changes of the market revolution. This is important to understand the planter South. Some planters well understood that for them to do well with cotton production, they needed demand. Whig policies supported factory growth, which was good for planters as long as economic policies did not hurt them at the same time. So some of the largest planters were Whigs. Planters were businessmen fundamentally. They operated their plantations to produce as much cotton as possible, weighing decisions about labor, cost, supply, and demand like any other good business owner. They operated within the constraints of the market. A well-functioning plantation made more money than factories or railroads and could yield as much as a 10% return for investment. That was real money. The impact of the cotton gin on cotton production can be seen in this basic graph. Numbers might vary in your textbook, but the overall trajectory should be the same. As the cotton gin became available to more farmers, yeomen and planters grew more cotton. Also note that after Americans built factories, in the early teens, the amount of cotton increased as well. American factories needed cotton, as did the English mills, and farmers responded. This is how the market works. Supply creates demand, or supply meets demand. Market-driven planters also had to deal with the issue of labor. Cotton was a persnickety crop. It needed to be planted, weeded, and harvested by hand. Boll weevils were pests that attacked cotton plants and also had to be removed by hand. The only pesticide in 1840 was 2 fingers. There were no pesticides, nor were there machines to harvest the plant until the 20th century. For now, planters attempting to eke out as much profit as possible had to find consistent, cheap labor. Slaves were the cheapest consistent labor available to planters. Planters did have obstacles to obtaining slaves, but none so difficult to overcome. During the writing of the Constitution, the founders, of course, provided for the end of the slave trade in 1808. These men considered slavery a necessary evil for themselves, but did not want to see it as a legacy for future Americans. But to grow more cotton, planters needed more slaves. Thus we saw breeding and sales in the Upper South in the antebellum period, not the colonial period, but the antebellum period. So we saw breeding and sales in the Upper South, where much of the soil was too depleted to continue extractive agriculture. Planters also started making sure their slaves lived in family units to repopulate their labor forces with relatively little expense. Thus planters with numerous slaves allowed slave communities to form on their properties and encouraged marriages between slaves on their plantations or on neighbors' plantations. With the gin and increasing number of slaves, planters could make a lot of money growing cotton. For that reason, cotton became king in the South. This may have been a review for you, but it was not the primary focus of this lecture. We are really here to examine how the market revolution and cotton created a Southern elite with the power and motives to protect their investments economically and politically. When most Americans think back on their knowledge of the South, they imagine a world of slave plantations with a leisure class of whites living in the big house and communities of slaves living in the slave cabins. Basically, they imagine Gone with the Wind. Since only 25% of the South owned slaves, this is not a perfect picture of the South. The other 75% were generally yeoman farmers, but there were some merchants, shippers, and others who facilitated the cotton economy. It helps to have a vocabulary to think about the South's demographics. Those who were comfortable to rich in that range most likely owned more than a few slaves. As the number goes up, we can see that the planters had a good number of slaves and that there were still a few we could call the planter aristocracy. These families were the richest in the South, and many of them were involved in politics, either state or national. They were also related to one another in some manner. Here we can look at just a few names of families that you might see in your readings. You can see in the corner the approximate number of slaves owned. The names on the graph represent old families of the South or families with men of great power. In this version, you can see some of the interconnections. Catherine Edmonton was the daughter of Devereux, and Chestnut became an aide to Davis during the war, that being Jeff Davis in the Civil War. Howell Cobb served as Georgia's governor, Speaker of the U.S. House, and Secretary-Treasurer, as well as the Speaker of the Provisional Congress of the Confederate States of America. At some point, you should also come across famous Civil War-era Southerners such as James Henry Hammond and Robert E. Lee. Most of these families were interconnected in some manner. If not family, definitely acquaintances at the upper levels. These folks owned mansions that had names, dozens of rooms, and good views of the landscape, and were full of the finest furnishings. These folks also owned several other homes, often in town or in other parts of the nation. Slaves allowed these families to have lives of luxury and ease, and they knew it. They had time for recreation, including organized hunts, regattas, those are boat races, horse races, and lavish parties and balls. This was the life of the rich and famous. The children of these families got their educations from private tutors or in Europe, thus there was no need for politicians to spend state or local money on building schools. No one wanted an educated class of yeomen who might question the power of the planter aristocracy. So these people had the money and the power to keep their children educated and keep the rest of the South uneducated. To give you another perspective on the reality of a Southern elite, please take a look at this graphic. In the South, just prior to the war, there were about 8 million whites. Just considering the 25% figure creates a minority of Southerners with advantages that the rest of Southern society, white or black, did not have. But breaking these numbers down further demonstrates how few people in the South controlled the bulk of economic power there. Slave owners felt compelled to justify their ownership of human beings. No matter how many times they called slaves property, they could not deny their humanity. Prior to 1820, slavery had been deemed a necessary evil that inspired even Southerners to ruminate over eliminating it, or at least manumitting their slaves. Thomas Jefferson, of course, had said that it was like, having slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears, and blamed King George for allowing it in the colonies in the early draft of the Declaration of Independence. For the founders, slavery was a temporary adaptation to the problems of the so-called New World: lots of land and too little labor. After 1820 and the showdown over Missouri, slave owners started to unify Southerners behind slavery. Northern politicians wanted to abolish slavery in the Louisiana Territory, and this was the start of political abolition. This stoked the fires of pro-slavery sentiment. Dissenters were driven out of Southern pulpits, schools, newspaper offices, and communities in general. They silenced the voice of anti-slavery in the South. From the 1820s to the Civil War, Southerners protected their rights to hold slaves and worked on convincing the nation that it was a right, and it was even a good, while the rest of the world was advancing freedom and eliminating slavery in the colonies of France, Great Britain, and Spain. The rise of the abolitionist movement in the 1830s only inflamed white Southerners. Strangely, for a society made up of mostly non-slave owners, the average American knows little about the yeoman farmer of antebellum America. These families made up the majority of the Southern population and lived much like Northern farm families. They generally raised crops to eat or use, and then pursued market crops to bring in cash. The goal was daily survival and trying to work ahead to a better future for their families in the short and long term. Most of the work was done by the farmer, his wife, their children, and any other family members that were living with them. If the farmer needed more help, he might have a hired hand, and if he could get enough cash together or got an inheritance, he might have the chance at some point to get a slave or two. Family members, hired hands, and slaves were all laborers that could help farmers raise cash crops and get into a better circumstance. This is known as economic mobility, or working up the economic ladder. These folks would have had a limited education because they lived in the South where public schools were far and few between. Planters did little to help these people better themselves, but tried to maintain good relations with them to have the support for the slave system. Yeomen could look to the planters for inspiration in terms of what the good life looked like, while planters made clear in words and deeds that the good life was made possible by utilizing inferior peoples, as they saw blacks, for labor. The message was basic but understandable. Better to be poor and white than to be black. The message was basic but understandable. Better to be poor and white than to be black. Planters created a race-based solidarity, with yeomen looking to economics and social ideas that they created, and the planters getting the support of the majority to keep slavery viable for that 25% who owned slaves. Planters showed hospitality and kindness to yeoman neighbors and family to keep those ties strong. A family facing hard times might get some supplies from nearby planters, or planters might hold gatherings on the plantation for local yeoman families, just to always keep what the good life looked like in front of the yeoman. The antebellum South was a land of contradictions. Planter and yeoman, rich and poor, free and slave, white and black. We only got to scratch the surface. A look into the women's history of the same period demonstrates the complications that affected them as well. But by looking at the elite, we get to see that most of Southern society, from the yeoman to the slave, worked very hard to survive and maintain the world of leisure that the elite enjoyed. Without them, the elite would not have had the labor or the support for slavery to continue their operations. And keep in mind that also meant they had the free time to participate in politics and protect the slave system. With slaves, drivers, and foremen doing most of the work on the plantations, the Southern planter aristocracy had the time for politics. They could go to the state capitals or Washington to keep their socioeconomic order in place. All in all, Southern whites felt superior to blacks, free or slave, and to Northerners. The irony, of course, was that had the yeomen been able to look past race, they would have seen that they had more in common with either of those groups than they did the planters. Together they could have created a more equitable version of Southern society for their benefit. These distinctions, nor the lack of understanding of their significance, continued in the South long after this era. The war and Reconstruction changed little, and poor white Southerners still refused to work with black farmers after the war, when the elite controlled the wealth even more so. The value of whiteness seemed too high to give up, even in the face of great poverty. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that this information will help you in your studies. We all hope to see you at PNC when you are done with your high school degree.